electrification of everything. You might be hearing that language, or all articles about heat pumps or induction cooking or electric cars. There's obviously a lot of media attention to this right now, and we'll be finding out why that is. The root of this kind of excitement that's happening and these advantages that we'll be talking about is that there's this whole new generation of really efficient appliances that are electric. They're driven with electricity, and they are really changing our homes and our lives for the better. Some people are familiar with these, but many people just aren't familiar with the advantages that they hold. These new products they outperform the things that we grew up with, all the devices that we're familiar with. In many cases, there's better versions of them now that many people don't know about. They provide new benefits. Sometimes they do new tricks that our old devices didn't do. They use dramatically less energy, which reduces our energy bills. And it also is a way to add value to our homes, which is also a really good thing. And this is generally referred to as electrification. So you will hear me use that term. You may hear it in the media, electrifying our homes, electrifying everything, et cetera. And one of the things that makes it possible is just these technological advances. And I love this comparison of items that we're familiar with in terms of how much more energy efficient they are now than they were 30 years ago. So this is really a look at how things that we grew up with operate compared to how the new ones do. And if you look at gas fired appliances like water heaters and furnaces, there's essentially no change. They're like a tiny bit more efficient, like 2% more efficient than they were 30 years ago. But if you look at these electric devices like heat pumps and air conditioners, refrigerators, and heat pump water heaters, which we'll be talking more about because a lot of people don't know about this technology, but you can see how much more dramatically energy efficient these devices are than they were just years ago. And there's a technology that is underlying all these ones that I'm showing here in blue, which are called heat pumps, and we'll talk more about that. It's a technology that's been around for hundreds of years, but it's getting better and better and better every year. And what it means is that these devices that really help us have comfortable and safe homes now use tiny amounts of energy compared to the devices they replace. And we'll dig into this more, but this is kind of like just an overall picture of what's happening with energy efficiency of gas appliances compared to electric appliances. All right, so the technologies we'll be talking about today are heat pump water heaters, which I mentioned, we'll go into in more detail. Heat pumps for space heating and air conditioning to keep our homes warm in the colder months and cool in the summer. Induction cooking, a much safer and more efficient and actually more pleasant way to cook, a more effective way to cook. And then, of course, electric vehicles, which are really changing the landscape of our transportation sector. So let's just think about our own homes for a minute, because I think this is a good way to bring home why there's so much advantage to these devices. The three largest energy expenses that a typical home would have, this is true anywhere, but in California, typically you would be looking to spend somewhere around $400 to $800 a year to heat your home, depending on what technology you're using. So a gas furnace would be closer to $400. Electric baseboard, which is one of these older electric technologies that hasn't changed much, more like $800. It's an expensive way to heat your home. And this is not even talking about cooling, this is just heating. Then, of course, hot water, that's a large expense. And for most people, it's actually larger than space heating in California. So close to $500 for a gas water heater if you're using the average amounts of hot water. If you've got, young kids teenagers in particular, taking showers, it might be higher than this, but some of us older folks use less hot water, and so it might be less than this, but still, this is the average number, close to 500 and almost 1,000 for an electric resistance water heater. And then cars are a giant energy expense that if you drive the average amount, it's close to $3,000 a year for each automobile. So you're talking about this aggregate number of close to 4,000 or close to 5,000, depending on which technologies you have and how much you use them. Every year that we spend, it's just kind of like a necessity to have a life that we expect to have. Let's compare that to the electrified home, or the home that's using these modern appliances. Home heating now, it's looking more like 340, 350, something like that a year, compared to almost 1,000 for some of those other examples we just looked at. Hot water heating, dramatically less. It's more like $230 a year. And transportation, this is where there's huge savings to be had. You're talking about a third of what you would expend otherwise. So less than $1,000 for each car. So this rolls up to about $1,500 compared to those numbers we saw before. So now you're looking at, with an electrified home compared to a home that's using those older technologies, you're looking at a $2,000 to $3,000 per year savings. And of course, this is going to vary by household, but these are just typical numbers. And you can see why that means that there's a lot of excitement with these technologies, and why there's so much buzz about it in the media, et cetera, and why we're here talking about it today. Okay, so we talked about lower energy bills, but there's other benefits that come along for the ride with these products that are equally important. Cleaner indoor air. We'll talk more about that in a minute. More comfort, because I think it's fair to say that, particularly during the pandemic, we all started spending more time at home. And so having a home that's comfortable and where you can be productive if you're still working, but you're just not taxed by the temperature problems or indoor air quality, that's a huge benefit. And then these devices also offer safety and less risk of fire and other health issues. And they dramatically reduce air pollution and carbon pollution. So a lot of what's happening in California is as the transportation sector gets cleaner, pollution from our homes is becoming one of the largest sources of air pollution, particularly in our cities. And so these devices that we're talking about have the opportunity to dramatically lower air pollution, and also the carbon emissions that are also a big factor in climate change and that many people are very concerned about. So we'll talk about all these things, and under this kind of like umbrella of electrifying your home. So let's talk a little bit about heat pumps to start with, because like I said, the technology, even though it's been around and we've had it in all of our homes for ages, a lot of people aren't familiar with the technology itself, and you don't really need to know how they work. But the simplest way to understand them, or kind of like familiarize yourself with them, is to think about your refrigerator. We all have these. Basically, it's a heat pump. What it's doing is it's moving heat from inside your refrigerator. So inside your refrigerator can be very cold, it's making ice even. And it's moving heat from inside your refrigerator to your kitchen. So your kitchen gets slightly warmer. You don't really perceive this, but you may have noticed it if you put your hand behind your refrigerator perhaps, and seen or felt that warm air that's coming from behind or sometimes underneath the refrigerator. That is basically the heat pump moving the warm air from inside the box to your kitchen. So these devices can work one way, like a refrigerator. They can sometimes work both directions, and we'll talk about that. They're in our cars, they're in air conditioners, they're in many of the products that we use. We don't really think about them. And the technology is just getting better and better and better and better every year. All right, so let's talk about water heaters and how heat pumps have been applied to water heaters. This is one of the more recent applications of this technology. These have been around for about 15 years now, but really become more popular and more perfected as a technology in the last 5 to 10. They look pretty much like regular water heaters, maybe a little bit higher tech, because they'll have this digital display, which offers some advantages. You can operate it remotely, et cetera, if that's important when you're traveling, et cetera. But it's got this heat pump on the top, which is taking warm air or air from the ambient environment. And with the heat pump, it's extracting the energy from that and essentially concentrating the heat energy into the water tank down below. They're incredibly reliable, which is what most people care about when it comes to hot water. You want hot water when you turn it on, but they're 3 to 5 times more energy efficient than any other way of heating water, which means they're the lowest cost to operate. And because these manufacturers are so kind of sure that this is the future of water heating, you'll see the longest product warranties with these. A typical gas or electric water heater would be a 6-year warranty. For a new one, these are 10. So you'll see these being offered from all the major manufacturers. This is roughly what they look like from 3 of the leading manufacturers in the United States. So they don't look that different. They can be more expensive to buy up front than a typical one, but we'll talk about incentives at the back end that essentially make these, in many cases, cheaper than any other kind of water heater to install. But the exciting thing from an operating standpoint is that there's just so much cheaper to operate. So you can see an electric storage, like we talked about, almost $1,000 a year, which is one of the reasons why gas has been popular. It's about half that. Gas tankless, a little bit cheaper, but heat pumps, in terms of operating costs, blow all these away in terms of the lower costs, closer to $200. And if you are interested in the carbon emissions from these devices, you will see that heat pumps also, the heat pump water heater produces the fewest carbon emissions, which means less air pollution, et cetera. And that's why governments are incentivizing these devices. California, which has really, aggressive targets about carbon reduction, they love this technology because they know that it makes our homes work better and also dramatically reduces carbon emissions. So that's why you see a lot of incentives around these programs for hot water heaters, heat pump hot water heaters. All right, so let's talk about space heating. The same technology can be used for space heating. And the thing that's really exciting about this version of the heat pump is that it can be used for heating and cooling. So it's basically a heat pump that works in both directions. It offers the advantages of more consistent and constant temperatures. And if you think about it, the reason why this is with a gas furnace, which we often use as a counterpart, the gas, when you turn it on, creates really high heat, like thousands of degrees. It's way too hot, basically. So it has to go on and off all the time in order to give you the 70 degrees or 75 degrees, whatever temperature you set it to in your home. What that means is that it'll be really warm next to the air vents, but it might be cooler across the room. It means that it's not operating that frequently. Whereas a heat pump offers more modest temperatures. It'll be warm air rather than really hot air, but it's operating almost all the time. So that means that you get more consistent temperature. If you set your thermostat to 72, let's say, it will be exactly 72 instead of going up to 74 and down to 68, et cetera, which a gas furnace would do. And compared to baseboard heat, it means that instead of it just being warm next to the baseboard heaters and cool across the room, your whole room gets warm. And there's more, because these are operating more continuously, that means more air through your filters, which means cleaner indoor air, which can be a really big deal during wildfire season in particular, because you can get really nice big air filters on there that will keep your indoor air clean. So all this adds up to superior health and comfort. They come in basically 2 versions that you'll see. One is the version that would replace a gas furnace. So it has this outside unit that looks a lot like an air conditioner. It's this box that sits outside your home, is connected into your home with refrigerant lines. And then there's another box that replaces the furnace, essentially, that's connected to all your ducts in your home, that's blowing the warm or cool air into your house. And as I said, these things can operate as an air conditioner or as a heater. So it's basically a heat pump that's working in both directions, either pulling heat from outside to warm your home or pulling heat from inside your home to dump to the outside to keep your house cool. And it's really important to know that you can put these 4-inch filters, these really thick air filters on there that do a fantastic job of scrubbing your air. And again, because wildfires are such a concern in California and many parts of the country, it's a really important thing to know about, because it can make a huge difference in terms of indoor air quality. So if you've got a gas furnace now, this is the version of a heat pump that you would be interested in. If you have baseboard heating, then you would want what's called a ductless system. And what it has an outdoor unit that looks a lot like the one that we just talked about. They come in different configurations. Some are cubes, some are more like suitcase size. But this will have this what's called a mini split or a ductless head on the wall. This mounts to the wall that blows either warm or cool air into your space. And you can have one for a couple of rooms. Sometimes these are embedded in the ceiling, so you don't really see them. but essentially it's just a way of not having to have the ducts in your home. You could, if you have baseboard heating, for example, sometimes you may put this into the rooms that you use the most and leave baseboard heating in maybe those spare bedrooms that you don't use that often. You can just turn it off when you're not using it, etc. So these are the most efficient way to heat, and they also provide cooling. They don't provide as much air filtration as the system we just looked at. So you might want to have a secondary air filter if you're worried about indoor air quality, but those are really easy to get and quite cheap. These things are incredibly efficient. We have it in the room that I'm in here, and they are fantastic. Most of the major manufacturers, basically all the manufacturers that do any kind of heating equipment, do these versions. So anyone who installs a gas furnace typically will also be able to install a heat pump, although there are some contractors who are more familiar with this technology, which we'll talk about later. But it's not something that is so crazy that people don't know about. In some parts of the country, this is the only way that people are really heating their homes, particularly in the Southeast. And there's whole countries like Japan and even some of the northern countries like Norway where this is the primary way of heating homes. So this technology has been around for a long time and it's super proven. But this is, again, why it's exciting from a cost standpoint, particularly if you have electric baseboard heating. That's where you're going to see the biggest savings. But even with a gas furnace, particularly if it's an older one, because what happens with gas furnaces is that their efficiency actually goes down as they age. So they're more expensive to operate the older they are. And you will see that you're going to get a modest cost saving by going to an electric heat pump. But you're also getting this air conditioning benefit, which the gas furnace obviously doesn't supply. And just like the water heater, from a carbon emission standpoint, if this is something you care about, and more people, the majority of people really do care about this. That's what the data says. Sometimes we don't think that way, so we're afraid to talk about it with our friends and neighbors. But the vast majority of people are worried about climate change, and so being able to do something positive for it is a nice thing. That's one of the side benefits. You'll be more comfortable, but you're also dramatically reducing your carbon emissions, which is something we should all be doing. And I neglected to mention it, but California has really aggressive goals about cleaning up its electricity. It has one of the cleanest sources of electricity in the whole country, but it's getting cleaner all the time, which means that the carbon emissions from these devices will continue to go down and down and down, and eventually to zero, literally, which is not possible with gas appliances. All right. So I also want to talk a little bit about cooking. And you may have been hearing about induction cooking lately. This is something that, again, the technology has been around for a long time, but it's sort of, in Europe, it's very common, but it's relatively new here in the United States. But people are excited about it because it offers much more precise temperature control than gas or electric resistance cooking. It's much faster, so things heat faster. They also cool down faster, which is really important. Like maybe some of you have had this experience with sauteing eggs or something like that, where you get the pan a bit too hot and then suddenly the eggs burn or get too cooked really fast because there's all this heat that's in the stove top itself in the grates. That doesn't happen with induction. So you could get really, when you turn it down, it goes down. When you turn it up, it gets hot really quickly. It's a glass surface, so it's really easy to clean, and it doesn't get hot to the touch, which we'll talk about, which makes it much safer. One of the things that you might have been seeing in the news is all this news about indoor air quality associated with gas stoves. And it's pretty serious what we're talking about here. This isn't just a little like, oh, be careful. This is like a real health concern, particularly for children and older adults. The American Medical Association has made this statement recently that use of a gas stove increases household air pollution and the risk of childhood asthma and asthma severity. It's also increases risk for older adults. In children, the risk increases 42% in homes that have gas heating. They're 42% more likely to develop asthma, which is really, that is very significant. Stanford recently made this study where they were measuring the benzene emissions, which is a cancer-causing agent from gas stoves, and they realized that it's similar to smoking in the home. So basically, operating even one gas burner is about the same as having someone smoking in your home in terms of these cancer-causing effects. And then the other thing that a lot of people just don't appreciate is that indoor air pollution from these devices in a very short time. The time it takes you to fry an egg, you can have levels of indoor air pollution that would be illegal if it was happening outside. There's no regulations for this inside. And even the vents, the hoods that we have typically are not as effective as we would like them to be. A lot of people don't even use them because they're really noisy. A lot of them, all they do is blow that bad air back into your homes. So venting is not a solution. It's better. And if you have one, you should absolutely use it, but it doesn't solve this problem. So the solution is to go to induction, where you have none of those carbon monoxide and nitrous oxide emissions, none of the benzene that we talked about, no leaking methane into your homes, which is another issue I didn't mention, but it happens. Stoves leak methane even when we're not using them. But one of the exciting things about them is the surface stays cool. So this is kind of like a funny picture here, but what this is a pot that's been cut in half. It's put on the burner. It's called a burner or a hob, but it's not burning anything. It's on. So when the induction stove is on, what it's doing is exciting the molecules in the pan. So the pan gets hot, but the glass surface gets warm because it's, absorbing some of the heat from the pan, but it's not hot itself. So that's why this chocolate bar is not melting on this hob that's turned on, but where the stove is attached to the pan, it gets hot. So it's melting the chocolate. So what this means is that if you spill something onto the surface of it, it's not going to bake on like it does with gas stoves or electric resistance. It's not going to, there's no nooks and crannies for it to get down into. It's not going to be hot, which means that you won't put your dish towels on fire or anything like that, which I've done in our home, our gas stove beforehand. So they're incredibly safe. It's why a lot of people love them, particularly if you have children in your home, because they can't hurt themselves, but it means you're not going to cause fires, etc., or burn yourself cooking. Okay, let's just talk about performance for a minute, because most people don't boil 8 quarts of water that often, but if you were to do it, what you would find is that you can do it twice as fast with electric induction than natural gas, even a big beefy burner. So if you're cooking pasta, it means half the time to warm the water, basically anything is going to be half the time to heat. And then the other thing that's amazing about these devices is all the energy goes to the food, not to your kitchen. So a gas stove, for example, which is why a lot of people don't like to cook on hot days, it heats your kitchen. An induction stove, all that energy goes into the food. Okay, they're made by almost everyone, and there's more and more options available all the time. We bought ours about 5 years ago, and there really weren't very many options, but now there's tons of them, from more entry-level models all the way up to the really professional kind of fancy ones that the premier homes have, like kind of industrial strength ones, and lots in between. Great ones to choose from. If you are interested in this, but you're not quite ready to splash out to buy a new range, which I totally understand, I would highly advise getting one of these little induction hobs, portable induction hobs, they're called. You can Google it on Amazon. You can find them for anywhere from $50 or $60 up to $100. They just plug right into the wall with a regular 110 outlet. You can put them on your countertop in your kitchen, and you can try this in your home. You need pots that are magnetic. So, like a copper bottom pot won't work, but most everything else, cast iron works, steel pots work, and you'll understand immediately why people like this. And for $60 or $100, you can try this. And then if you like it at some point, you can maybe upgrade the device you have. All these things we've been talking about, these appliances are made by brands that we grew up with. The technology may be unfamiliar, but the brands that make them, they're the exact ones that we've worked with for a long time. And so I guess my point is that this isn't some kind of fringe thing that's happening on the side. All the manufacturers see that these technologies we're talking about are the future. And so all their R&D, their best warranties, their best people working on this. And that's why you see more and more options available for these all the time. All right. You probably have heard more about electric vehicles than any of these other things, but there's still some really exciting news that a lot of people don't get in the talk about EVs. There's a lot of conversation about range anxiety, et cetera, and that's a real thing. We can talk about it, but in California, there's so much charging infrastructure now, that is less of an issue. But one of the things that people don't often talk about is just how economically advantageous EVs are. I love this comparison. This is 2 versions of the exact same car that's made by Hyundai It's the Kona. There's a little gas SUV, and there's exactly the same car that's got an electric drivetrain, the Kona EV. And you'll see that for $10 of gas, you can go about 54 miles in the gas version. For $10 of electricity, you can go 3 times as far, 156 miles. This is why the auto industry knows they can't ignore this. This is why the shipping industry is really interested in electric technology. And this is why for us as homeowners and just regular people, there's massive savings that are associated with turning to electrification. And then of course, from a carbon emission standpoint, there's just no comparison. I mean, it's dramatic reductions in carbon emissions that come from electric cars compared to gas cars. And as I mentioned, as our grid gets cleaner, which is happening all the time, these emissions will go to zero for an electric car, which will never happen with your gas vehicle. The other thing that I think is important to point out to people is these cars are much more, they're cheaper to buy than you think that they are up front. The reason why people have this idea that they're expensive is that the sticker price when you're doing some comparison shopping can look dramatically. It's higher. So again, these two versions of the same car, it's a great way to see this. About $10,000 difference in the cost between these two versions of the same car, although the electric vehicle prices are dropping and the gas vehicle prices are increasing. So this used to be more like $12,000 or $13,000 difference a few years ago. It's $10,000 now. But in California, you can get $9,500 in rebates from the feds and also from the state, which makes it essentially parity in terms of the initial costs. But then let's look at operating costs. We saw how much cheaper they are to operate. So rather than $11,000 worth of gasoline over 5 years, if you drive this, the average amount that people drive in California, it'd be closer to $4,000. And then these cars require virtually no maintenance. You're talking about windshield wipers, literally, windshield wipers, windshield wiper fluid, and new tires after 5 years. That is the maintenance that's required. There's no tune-ups, there's nothing. So you're talking about $8,000 cheaper to own and operate over 5 years than the gas version of the exact same car. So it's harder to make this comparison between cars that don't have their equal, counterpart nearby. But this comparison in terms of value is true for any electric vehicle. It's a really good bang for your buck in terms of transportation. And as we saw, dramatic reductions in terms of carbon emissions. All right, so I hope you understand now a little bit about why people are so excited about electrification. And as homeowners, you see these benefits that we feel every day in terms of costs and quality of life and comfort and safety and carbon emissions reductions. These things are also important at the societal level. So all these things we've talked about make our world better. It cleans up air. If you think about it for a minute, where does air pollution come from? The major sources of air pollution are from burning fossil fuels. So when we go to these clean devices that are operating on cleaner and cleaner electricity all the time, it cleans up our air. And you can already see it in cities around the country as more of this technology is adopted. Cleaner air means healthier people. It lowers our healthcare costs, which is a really important part of our economy to make our economy stronger by avoiding those unnecessary costs and adopting these new technologies, which bring great jobs, et cetera, and obviously better for the climate. So I think I hope you see all these reasons why people are excited about this transformation. We've been talking about costs with today's costs of energy. It's also true that these benefits, these cost savings are going to get better and better over time. This is information from the California Public Utility Commission, which did a study on expected costs of electricity and gas and gasoline over the next 10 years. And their conclusions were, yes, electricity prices will go up. I'm sorry, that's just a reality. But gasoline prices and natural gas prices are expected to go up twice as fast. So that means that 5 or 10 years from now, these savings will be potentially twice what we're talking about today. And then the other interesting piece of news is that these devices add value to our homes. This is a study from the University of Maryland, where they showed that just heat pumps, that one device, adds $10,000 to $17,000 in value to homes across the United States. And this will vary from place to place, but this is the average for the United States. So you can see that as more people understand this technology and adopt it and want it, having it in our homes make our homes easier to sell and worth more money. Okay, a lot of this is about buying new stuff, and that can feel daunting, and it's expensive. It's not you can't sugarcoat that. Although I would say all these devices we've talked about wear out, furnaces wear out, water heaters wear out, cars wear out, stoves wear out. So they will be replaced. So you might not be rushing out and doing this tomorrow. Maybe you've got some devices that need replacing in your home now. Maybe you just want to really reduce your carbon emissions, and so you might do it even with devices that aren't that old. Whatever your motivation, there's going to be costs involved, but there are incredible incentives available to you in California, the highest incentives anywhere in the country available from the state, from utilities, and from the federal government. So what I'm showing you today are some of the incentives that are available for these devices we've talked about. Will vary a little bit depending on which utility you're a member of, but these are typical numbers. So between state and utility and federal credits, $3,500 for a heat pump water heater, which essentially you can put in a heat pump water heater for close to no money when you apply all these incentives. $4,000 for a heat pump to heat and cool your home, $500 for an induction stove, $800 for a heat pump dryer. We didn't talk about dryers too much, but dryers are another big source of energy. And almost $10,000 for an EV, $150 for an energy audit. We'll talk about this in a minute, but this is a really important thing to know about. There's money for weatherization to insulate our homes and replace windows and doors. Some are older homes in particular might need insulation and might need some wiring upgrades to make these devices possible. There's money from the feds and from utilities, et cetera, for this. And then EV charger, another $500, which is really nice to have so you can charge at home and not have to go to a charging station. So the point is that there's just a lot of money available. It can be confusing, and which is why we're going to be talking about this more in depth, and each of these devices will go deeper into it in subsequent conversations. But this is the opportunity to see the possibilities that are out there. And we would really highly advise, if you're interested in getting started with this, regardless of where you are and what kind of home you have, how old it is, a great place to start is with what's called a home energy audit. And we'll tell you about how you can find these people, but a professional will come to your home, walk through your home, look at your attic or your walls or your basement or whatever it is, and examine all your insulation, your doors, your appliances, and they'll give you a report about the state of your insulation and your ducts and give you advice on whether those things need to be upgraded. Windows and doors, same. Maybe you've got some older windows that are leaking or something that could really save you money if you replace them. Some older homes may need wiring and electrical panel upgrades. They'll tell you about that. They'll look at your heating and water heating and appliances and talk to you about potentials for upgrading that. They'll give you recommendations on those upgrades. They'll estimate the cost of doing that and also the potential savings from doing that. And most of them will know about these incentives that we've talked about as well. So they'll give you basically a report on your home that is a great place to start in terms of figuring out what to do first, what order to do things, where you might save the most money, et cetera. Highly recommend that. There's a great website called The Switch Is On in California. It's dedicated to energy consumers in California. It's a great place to find an energy auditor to get information about incentives. So a lot of that information I just showed you came from this website. So Google Switches On or go to theswitcheson.org and you'll find all this information. You can put in your zip code. It'll tell you exactly what's available to you in your location. I'm also a big fan of Rewiring America, which is another great, both these are nonprofits. They're not trying to make money from you. They're just trying to give you good information about the benefits that are out there. Rewiring America is a great place to go to get information about these federal incentives that I mentioned for all these various devices and more. And they also have great information just about a lot of things we talked about, the benefits of electrification, how to do it, et cetera. So I highly recommend these two resources as a way to get started. All right, I think that's it from me. I really appreciate your attention today, and I'm happy to answer any questions. And yeah, let's turn it over to David.
All right, thank you so much, Brian. That was so informative. Really appreciate your great presentation and that 30,000-foot view of the benefits available for us. We're going to move into our Q&A session now. So I'm joined by my fellow AARP member and volunteer, Bob Pratt, who will be taking the Q&A and presenting the questions to our panelist here, Brian. So we'll go ahead and just get right into it. Thank you so much for submitting. We have over 20 questions, so we're going to try to get to them as quick as possible. So we have Susan asking our first question: what is the best way to actually access funding from the Inflation Reduction Act? Do we need to ask our accountant? Is there a form to fill out? What are the logistics?
That's a great one. There are a couple of important things to know about the Inflation Reduction Act. And again, I highly advise you check out that Rewiring America site. But there's also really good FAQs available from the IRS. So if you Google IRS, Inflation Reduction Act, frequently asked questions, something like that, you're going to get this one-page document from them, which is really good. It's long, but it's got all the details you need. But there's a couple of things that are really important to know about the Inflation Reduction Act. One is there's specific efficiency requirements for the devices that qualify. So that means that you can't just put in any heat pump. It has to be a heat pump of a certain efficiency. The installers will know this. A good installer will know this, but it's an important question to ask your installer if you're getting a new heat pump. Say, will this qualify for IRA incentives? And if they can't tell you, then you shouldn't work with that person. Find someone who can tell you yes, and here's why. So that's one thing to know about. The other important thing to know about is that there are caps for these individual devices. You know, I showed you some of those, like for example, $2,000, up to $2,000 for a heat pump, up to $2,000 for a heat pump water heater. But if you put in a heat pump water heater and a heat pump in the same year, you wouldn't be able to get the full value. So there's some complexities in terms of, you know, not doing things all at once to get the maximum value. And there's information about that on Rewiring America. There's information on our website, Electrify Now, about these things. If you go to Electrify Now and go to our Take Action page, we have some really good one-pagers on the Inflation Reduction Act that can help you with that. But so there are some complexities there that we just didn't have time to get into, but it's not really that difficult. And then when it comes time to fill out your taxes, there will be a place on the tax form that your accountant will know about, or if you're doing it with H&R Block or whatever, they'll know about this too, where if you've installed one of these energy efficient appliances, you can apply for these credits.
Thanks, Brian. And before turning it over to Bob to ask our next question, I'm really happy that this was our first question that we asked, because this is actually one of the reasons why we're having the Power Your Savings with AARP webinar series. We're going to be having dedicated episodes to many of the complex issues that we've kind of talked about here. And we're really appreciative of Brian giving us that 30,000 foot kind of level to kind of start us off here. But we're really looking forward to bring you some of those more in-depth kind of conversations as this series continues. So Bob, turn over to you for our second Q&A question.
Hey, thanks so much, David. And thanks, Brian, for this great information, especially on Clean Air Day in California. This addresses a couple issues in the Q&A. And so if I have gas or I have electricity, and you alluded to this, if I get an EV car, may have to have some work done on my panel, my electric panels. Can you talk about that a little bit? And I was thinking maybe if you have the work done, I may have at the same time my house panels all done to electrify myself for the future. If I sell my house, it must be a good deal.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And, you know, essentially, if your home is older than about 20 years old, or somewhere between 20 and 30 years was kind of like a place where homes went from 100 amp panels to 200 amp panels. And sorry for the techies speak here, but it basically meant from a smallish panel to a much larger panel. These larger panels in modern homes, these 200 amp panels, they can handle anything we've talked about. An older home that has a 100 amp panel, and if you look inside, you'll probably see it. It says there, those panels, those homes can have some challenges to electrify. It's possible to do with 100 amps, but most of the time the electricians are going to tell you we need to put in a bigger panel, which can be expensive. That's why these incentives are important. But so that's one thing. The other thing is that, you know, you may need new circuits being wired inside your home. Like, for example, if you've got a gas stove and that has a gas oven in it, then most likely and you wanted to put in an induction stove to get better indoor air quality, you would need an electrician to run a 240 volt circuit from your panel. Regardless of how big it is, you're going to need a new circuit run to where your stove is in order to plug the new device in. And if you want a new electric car charger, you might need the same thing. You might need a new circuit put in. So there can be panel upgrade issues, but there can be new wires to run, et cetera. An electrician is almost always involved with these things, particularly if you're transitioning from gas. If you have an electric resistant stove right now and putting in an induction stove, it's just, you just pull one out and put the other one right in. Same for a water heater. It's very straightforward. But switching from gas to electric often means you have some electrical work done. And Bob, you mentioned it. If you can do these things one at a time, have the electrician come out one time to put in your electric car charger, another time to do your stove. If you're thinking, well, I want to do the stove today or the water heater, whatever it is that you're starting with, I'm thinking I might want a stove or a car charger later. You can save yourself a lot of money by telling your electrician what your plan is and have them do a lot of this work at once. You can save yourself thousands of dollars because essentially every time the electrician comes to your home, there's something like somewhere between $500 and $1,000 that they're charging you just to get there. So you can save that money by, putting these projects together if you're thinking about doing multiples.
Thanks so much, Brian. So our next set of questions is around kind of the idea that the cost of electricity seems to be getting higher and higher with rate increases, unfortunately. Something, side note, that AARP is actively campaigning against, given the affordability issues facing our state. But could you just maybe talk a little bit about, what that means if you do convert your home to 100% all electric, thinking about how rates are kind of going up? I know that gas is a little different, right? Unlike electric rates, which are just kind of a set rate, gas is both a set rate, but also market driven, right? Which is depending on various kind of market factors. But I think that's a really good question that a lot of people are having is, what happens if I switch from my gas appliances to all electric? Am I really going to save money? What does that look like?
Yeah. It's a great question. And historically, and this is the reason why this is such a good question is, for most of our lifetimes, it's been true that you would save money by going to gas appliances, which is why these things are so popular. That's just not true anymore for two reasons. One, because these new version of the electric devices is so much more energy efficient. They're using so much less energy. So you'd be using less electricity many times than we would have been in the past. And also the relative costs of gas and electricity is changing dramatically and is projected to change even more dramatically going forward. There was just a report that I saw from AARP. I'm not even sure what that stands for, but they're an energy efficiency kind of nonprofit energy geeks, basically. They've been looking at energy costs around the country. And with the things that are happening with the gas industry regarding like upgrading infrastructure, because there's a lot of old pipes that need to be replaced, they often don't think about. We're very aware of the infrastructure that's needed for electricity. It's a common conversation. The same thing is needed for our gas system. So there's costs associated with upgrading these pipes that are really high. There's costs of lowering the carbon emissions from the gas sector, which are in many states required now, including California. That's adding costs. And then just the product cost, the commodity costs of gas itself are also going up. So essentially what that's meaning is that people are saying that gas costs could double or even quadruple in the next 10 years. Electricity costs will go up, but nobody's talking about that kind of increase. And the reason is because the cost of generating electricity, solar and wind, is going down. So the increase that we're going to see in electricity is due to distribution upgrades and more lines, more resilience baked into the system. That's basically about the wires, but making the energy, the actual cost of making it is going down. So that's why we're not going to see the dramatic increases in electricity. Yes, they will go up, but they won't be as dramatic as we'll see in gas and gasoline.
Brian, if you want to keep on with that thread, I noticed there's some confusion because some people see that the gas appliances you sometimes don't accrue as much savings as the electric appliance. And if you want to clarify that, I think what you were saying, but you need to say it in your own words, that the raw product is of gas is more expensive, but sometimes the gas appliance happens to be more expensive than the resistance electrode. Can you clarify that? Yeah.
Well, there's the, I guess when we're talking about this transition, there's really three costs that are important to understand. There's the energy costs themselves, there's how much of the energy you use, and then there's the cost of the device or switching from one device to another. So the energy costs it's the playing field is tipping in favor of electricity. Electricity costs won't rise as quickly as gas. That was what we were talking about a minute. And then there's the efficiency piece, how much energy you use. And gas appliances just are not getting more efficient. They're basically the same. They haven't really changed. There's not a lot of upside for them to get better from an efficiency standpoint, because it's basically a technology that has no headroom, if you want to think of it that way. Whereas the heat pumps, they're way more efficient than they were, and they're going to get more efficient going forward. So electric devices are getting more efficient and will get more efficient, which means they use less of an energy source that costs less. And then there's the product device costs. And typically what you find is the devices that we're talking about, like a heat pump water heater, is more expensive than a gas water heater. If you just were shopping and looked at comparing the prices. That's why the incentives that we just talked about are so important, because the incentives essentially equal the cost, the product cost of these devices. So now if your water heater broke and you have a gas water heater right now, you wouldn't get incentives for replacing it. It would cost you X. If you replaced it with a water heater, you go, wow, that's going to cost me $2,000 more than if I just replaced it with a gas water heater. But the incentives essentially eliminate all that additional costs. And it might actually be cheaper to replace a gas water heater with an electric heat pump water heater because of these incentives. So you see, that's why the cost conversation, you have to really think about it in terms of energy costs, efficiency, which is how much energy you use, and then the cost of the product. And what's happening is in every view of those costs, the electric version of it is winning out in terms of actual costs to us. Yeah. I hope that makes sense.
I know it does. And really just to also bring it home too, to kind of a personal experience. I actually had that personal experience that you just described, Brian, which I live in California here, and replaced a 30-year-old gas water heater. And I was paying a lot of money, I think, for a lot of Californians on this call that have lived through the last couple of winters where our gas bills were several $100s, way more than average, right? Because of the market costs, I was told. I switched to an electric heat pump, which, by the way, I had the savings from the state. There was like a state grant. This was before the Inflation Reduction Act, which we can get to in another Power Your Savings webinar, that there's lots of California-specific incentives that have been around
really
for several years. And not only did I pay 75% of the total cost because of these incentives on a new electric water heater, I was paying less in my overall energy bills by a lot. And I never really had the same problems that other people with more gas in their homes had during those kind of price spikes. So thank you, Brian, for giving us that. And thank you for these questions. These are fantastic questions. This is why we want to ask them here. I also see some people putting in the Q&A some really great kind of tips too. I saw that somebody mentioned that some libraries, I've heard of this new, it's really cool, libraries of things. You can actually lend out, or you can rent an induction stove to try it out from your local library. I thought that was so cool. I can't wait to look at that option in my local library here.
Yeah, sorry, David, to interrupt, but just since you mentioned it in the chat, I bet there's a lot of people who are on this call right now who have induction stove, let's say. And if you do, if you're someone listening here and you've got an induction stove, tell us what you think about it. I mean, I'd be surprised if you don't like it, but let's hear about it. So just if you don't mind, if any of you have any of these devices, a heat pump water heater, a heat pump, electric car, an induction stove, any things that we've talked about, put it in the chat, because I think sometimes it really helps for us to hear from each other. You know, I mean, you're hearing it from me and from David, but, you know, a lot of you in the audience probably know, maybe have experienced these. We'd love to hear your experiences.
Yeah. So to go back to just a very quick, very individual question, we have someone that's asking, could you compare electric tankless water heaters to other kind of modes?
Yes. Electric tankless water heaters are, they're good for a very limited applications. And that application is basically one where you don't use it very often. So in general, I'm not a fan of that technologies, except for these, like, maybe you've got a, I don't know, and maybe you got a sink in your home that you almost never use, or maybe you've got an ADU in your backyard, or an outbuilding that you almost never use, but every once in a while you need a little bit of hot water out there. That might make sense. But for day-to-day use, electric tankless does not make sense. It's electric resistance. It's not heat pump. So it's actually going to be about the same, if not more, to run than a tank, an electric tank. So I don't think I know for a fact there's no big savings. They're huge energy draw. They need giant electrical cables to them because they use so much energy. I would not recommend that technology unless you have this really, unusual case where you got, something that's not used very often.
Great. Well, it looks like we're almost at time, so I think we have time for one more question. Bob, do you want to ask the last question that you see in the Q&A?
Yeah, there is a interesting question here about advice for engaging providers and funders of electrification at the scales above the individual. Are there organizations like yours that specifically come to help promote this at the group level in various regions of California, or is this strictly a go at your own and figure it out yourself type environment?
If the question is about, like people who can give you advice, and maybe in your community, there are organizations that are trying to do that, and they're trying to create like ambassadors, basically, someone maybe that lives in your neighborhood or in your community who's done some of these things. And one of the conversations we're having with AARP is whether we can figure out how to make it easier for you to find those people. But the Switches On, for example, is trying to build a kind of a network of people like that across California where you can get good advice locally. But there is a lot at the moment. There's a little bit of poking around you need to do. That's why I love the Switches On website, because it's got so good information. It can be localized for your area, and your utility can even give you recommendations about contractors, etc. There are some neighborhood organizations that I'm familiar with in California, like San Mateo has one, Palo Alto has one, where they're little electrification groups that will try to promote the benefits locally. So that exists, but I don't have an easy way for you to connect to those groups.
Well, thank you, Brian. Are some of the HOAs involved in this also? We have some people from HOAs. Do HOAs help with this, or you're pretty much on your own there too?
I think in HOAs and multifamily living situations, condominiums maybe that where there's the opportunity potentially for group buying and that sort of thing, because a lot of times these condos were built all in the same time, and so they're going to experience appliance failure or aging about the same. So there can be savings. We've done it here where we organize with a contractor to come in and replace 3 water heaters all on the same day, and you're going to save money by doing that. So I think there are some really cool opportunities to do that. That's something that it takes a little organization on your side, but I can guarantee you that if you and your neighbors in let's say an HOA or a condo type of situation all want to do this at the same time, you can save some money by having a contractor do it all at once.
Thank you.
I'm happy to answer questions about that if someone had a specific question on that one later. You can we'll make sure people have my email address.
Yes, and actually we are running out of time here, so we'll go ahead and end it there. I want to give a special shout out to everyone putting in the Q&A. Sorry that the chat wasn't working, but we literally had 20 or 30 people just start putting in all of their experiences with electrifying and the great benefits that they've enjoyed there. But thank you all so much for joining us today. So what we'll do is actually we'll get up on our last slide here, some contact information and also a link to our survey. But Brian, actually, while we have you and we get that slide up, is it electrifynow.org or electrifynow.net?
.net, electrifynow.net.
Okay, great,
Yeah.
great. Okay, so again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for our very first Power Your Savings webinar. It's been a blast. Thank you for spending your lunchtime on a Wednesday with us. We're looking forward to do more of these, especially now that we've gotten some great questions from you that, sorry, we didn't have a chance to get to all of them, but we're absolutely going to be using those to inform future episodes. Like Brian was mentioning, the thing that we're asking folks to consider first is a home energy audit, and that we'll have a little bit more information on our website, Power Your Savings AARP website there. Thanks, Shay, for putting that back. But actually, if we can put back, Shay, the QR code, we want to make sure that if you have a chance today, if you could scan that and answer a couple questions to provide some feedback on today's call. Again, this is the first of our Power Your Savings with AARP call, and you have an opportunity to help help us shape the rest of the episodes. So again, thank you all so much for joining. We're looking forward to see you again very soon, and hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care.